In the red corner, pumping trillions of dollars into the economy in mere months, the institution you love to hate, the Federal Reserve. And in the blue corner, weighing 4.3 quintillion pounds and responsible for all life on Earth, the sun. Who will win the title for the ultimate inflation instigator?
Let's get ready to rumble!
The commonly accepted narrative for the last 50 years is central banks around the globe are able to control or manipulate inflation through interest rates. Now, the anomaly for this theory has always been Japan. But what about Japan? We wanted to use Japan and see if it fit into some other narratives that are potentially going on behind the scenes. While exploring this anomaly of Japan, we come across the work of Russell Clark. What Russell's recent research has promoted is this idea that Japan has been in a food deflationary environment since the blow up in 89-90, and how the food deflationary environment ties into wage deflation as well, and how these two are highly correlated, except we don't know which way the causal errors go, or if there's some form of reflexive feedback loop between the two. Russell's thesis is, until we see a pickup in either food prices or wage prices, and combining into that feedback loop, then we'll not see a subsequent pickup in inflation. He believes that's right around the corner, looking at protein prices in Asia, and potentially turning this tide of a 40-year decline in food and wage prices in Japan. This Japanese research led us to go back to research done by Sean Hackett, who advises agricultural producers, and it made us start to wonder, is there a causal error between solar cycles, to crops, to wages, to potentially inflation?
Hey everyone, Corey here. I think I'm gonna need some soothing music to get through this one. Ah, that's better. And if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, that might help me persevere. As it turns out, there's a cosmic rhythm that permeates our solar system like a metronome. Around every 11 years, the sun's magnetic field completely flips. North becomes south, and south becomes north. This gives rise to solar seasons where we witness shifts in solar activity. And this flip has really important implications for what's happening here on Earth.
Well, sir, you've certainly vanquished all your enemies, the elementary school, the local tavern, the old age home. You must be very proud.
No, not while my greatest nemesis still provides our customers with free light, heat, and energy. I call this enemy the sun.
The sun goes through very active periods and very dormant periods. During active periods, we tend to see more sunspots and solar flares, with subsequently higher temperatures here on Earth. During dormant periods, we tend to typically expect cooler temperatures here on Earth. So in conjunction with these sun cycles, we have oceanic cycles. We have the AMO and the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation and the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. And basically what these are these 40-year approximate cycles where the oceans go through warming and cooling cycles. If we look at these 4-decade oceanic oscillations, from the 1890s to 1940, we were in a warming period. And as we saw in the 1930s, we had very violent, very warm weather that led to the Dust Bowl in the United States. From 1940 to 1980, we were in a cooling period. And we even had things like Time magazine coming out asking if we were in the next ice age as we were going into the late 1970s. Since 1980 to 2020, we've been in a general warming period.
The AMO and PDO measure the variation in ocean temperatures that occur over multi-decade periods. And these temperature changes appear to have profound effects upon weather patterns. For example, the probability of droughts increases significantly during negative PDO periods. What causes these ocean temperature fluctuations remains highly debated, but recent papers suggest that solar activity may play a critical role.
What's interesting about the sun, it has multiple periodicities to its cycles. There can be 2,400-year cycles, 200-year cycles, 88 years, and 11 years. When these cycles tend to line up, we can have what we call grand solar cycles.
And in recent solar cycles, we've been seeing a consistent decline in solar activity. Why? One potential answer: gravitational tides. You see, while we often think about the planets orbiting the sun, most of us don't consider that the sun itself isn't actually sitting still. As it turns out, all the celestial bodies orbit the solar system's barycenter, including the sun. This occurs because they are all exhibiting gravitational pull on one another. When certain planetary alignments occur, and in particular with the Jovian planets, i.e. Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, studies show increasing and decreasing solar activity. In particular, the 11-year cycle is linked closely with Jupiter, and the longer 90-year Gleisberg cycle is linked closely with Uranus. Incorporating interaction effects between the planets leads to a model that provides a strong fit to historical sunspot data. One theory is that their combined gravitational effects may alter the very stratification of plasma on the sun. Like the superposition of waves, these shorter-term and longer-term cycles have additive effects. When both cycles simultaneously hit their minimum, it implies lower solar activity.
And so if you're in a combinatory effect of a grand solar cycle of warming, you'll expect warming here on Earth, and vice versa for if you have a grand solar cycle of a cooling period. If we tie in these oceanic cycles with the solar cycles, we haven't been in a grand solar cycle that's gone through a dormant or cooling period, tied in with the oceanic cycles in a cooling or dormant period since 1790 to about 1840. And during that cycle, we saw food prices increase by 4x.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
Okay, a simple wrong would have done just fine, but...
The problem with this entire thesis is that while the varying intensity of solar cycles is proven, its impact on global climate is not. In this presentation from Professor Joanna Hay, she shows that the global average impact may be minimal, while the regional impacts may be more extreme.
So on the right hand there, again, is a picture of the global effects and the contributions of ENSO, that's El Nino, which is a large contribution to global tropical sea surface temperatures, which contributes to global temperature change, and the other factors I've already described. But on the left, instead of having a global average, we're looking at maps over the surface of the Earth. We've got the El Nino with a big warming in the tropical sea surface. We've got the volcanoes, which are sort of cooling almost everywhere, mostly over the tropics. This is anthropogenic, so this is greenhouse gases, and most of the warming is over northern hemisphere land surface, but it's warming everywhere. But then the solar cycle changes, interestingly, are pretty much zero in the tropics, but have some signal in mid-latitude, so 40 to 50 degrees each side of the hemisphere. And here's another picture of estimate of what the solar cycle effect is doing. This, confusingly, is low sun minus high sun, so it's the opposite way around to the picture I just showed you. But it's suggesting that when the sun is less active, we get colder weather over here and warmer weather over Greenland. And this is a well-known pattern of variability in climate called the North Atlantic Oscillation. So the regional effects of the sun are much more complicated and different than just the sort of global average picture.
If we take an Americentric view of the last 40 years, we've been in this amazing warming period that has led to a 30-day extension in our harvest cycles and has opened up a lot more arable land in the northern Midwest and even into Canada. This has led to an amazing abundance of food, which has had a deflationary effect on food prices. The question is, if we're about to go through a 4-decade cooling cycle, are we going to see a reduction in that harvest schedule and leading to less arable land? Also, with more La Nina effects, we would see longer, harsher winters and shorter, hotter summers, and we'd see much more volatility in the spring and fall when you have planting and harvest cycles. If we've been riding these external forces of cheaper food prices, what happens when food prices start to escalate? What does that lead to on a societal level? Do we just raise the wage prices along with the food inflationary prices? We're not certain if this provides any answers, but it does beg the question, who has more power, the sun or the Fed over inflation? So Corey, I dragged you into this subject semi-unwillingly. But what's your recap after going through this week's exercise and research?
So the broadly accepted narrative is that central banks have some sort of influence over the inflation rate, given their control of policy interest rates. And as per usual with every economic situation, Japan is the outlier here. They've had incredibly low policy rates for decades and inflation that has been largely negative through the late 90s and early 2000s. So I think this actually ended up being a very interesting topic for me to think outside the box and ask, is there a latent factor here? Maybe we're all just fooling ourselves. Maybe this has everything to do with climate and input costs and less to do with policy rates. And I think that's really interesting. As I went through the actual research, what I walked out the other side saying was there are definitely climate effects, and these sun cycles definitively exist, but the effects seem to be very regional. So you might see agricultural cost inflation in one region and deflation in another as we go through these cycles. So I think the question is, are there certain areas of the world that are responsible for most of the food output, and how is climate affecting those regions?
You know, the idea here is we're obviously not climate scientists, right? We're dilettantes, we're researching all this, but our idea in general is just kind of put a bug in people's ear or in their mind to go, you know, what if we're wrong here? That was our overarching premise, is like, what if you're wrong? What if there's multiple forces at play that interact in complex systems, interacting with complex systems? So maybe it's not as clearly defined as the Fed's role, and that's what we just kind of wanted to think outside the box a little bit. Do you think the Fed is a front runner and a driver, or a trend follower?
I think the Fed tries to be a front runner, but ultimately ends up being responsive to macroeconomic situations because they're working mostly with what they think is hopefully leading data, but I think is lagging data.
It's interesting to me is like, are they driving the car, or are they the child in the back seat with a plastic steering wheel thinking they're driving the car? It's hard to tell.
One thing I really do want to stress here, by the way, is that we are not climate scientists. We are not astrophysicists. We are purely tourists. And please don't hate on us in the comments.
Yeah, this is obviously, this is a video for fun and entertainment. I hope that's quite clear.